Good evening, everybody. Those who join us here live and those who join by live stream. The video that was supposed to play was actually an interview that was done a few years ago of a bunch of people in St. Peter's Square asking the question, what's the best and worst thing that the church has done? And quite a few of the people couldn't answer much about the best. Well, they give things to the poor, right? Or they teach some things about holiness, little things. The worst things, of course, they were quite easy to recall. The Crusades pops up, and then definitely the sexual abuse scandals. And so that's a question I'd like us all to ask ourselves. If somebody were to ask us, what has the church done? What would our answer be? And I don't need to know your answer, but to have a moment to think about that. Because the title of this was How Christ Built Our World, but Christ works in the world through his followers. He left his 12 apostles to do that work for him. And the Holy Spirit works through them and then through the followers that came up after them. And so, for the sake of this presentation, when I refer to the church, I am talking about the followers of Christ. Now, this most commonly is the Roman Catholic Church, and even specifically in a lot of the details I'm sharing, is usually the Roman Catholic Church, though occasionally it may connect to other Christian denominations who are faithfully following Christ as best they can. What it also does not necessarily include are a plethora of people who claim to be Christian, claim to be followers of Christ, but don't actually follow the precepts of Christ. There have even been popes and clergy who have not followed these teachings. Never would Christ have put forward the idea of a crusade. He wouldn't have liked the Spanish Inquisition. He certainly would have been upset about the sexual abuse scandals. None of this fits with the teachings of Jesus Christ. All of these are aberrations of that teaching. And to remember that as we talk about the church, that there are people within the church who live according to Christ's teaching and sometimes not. And sometimes that's even the same person. But we're focusing on how the teachings of Christ in particular have changed things throughout history. So that's the focus point of this particular presentation. Now, remember that let's go back to asking the question, why did God choose when he did to become incarnate? I've often asked myself this question, and there's really no solid answer to that. We can never really know what God was thinking about why he chose to enter Palestine around 1 AD. There's a couple different theories, but why he chose that exactly, who knows? But part of that, I often wonder, is if that was the best time possible. And I would think that today would actually be better than then, as his whole point was to share the gospel message, to preach to the world, to set us free from sin and death. And wouldn't it have been better to do that with the internet and technology that would be able to spread that message instantaneously around the world? But he didn't choose now to come. He chose then. And I often wonder if it's because he knew we wouldn't get here without him. That there appears to be a sort of classical barrier, a point in history where humanity could get to on its own and couldn't get any further. This classical barrier is usually what we refer to as the ancient times, but something we don't seem to appreciate is how much happened then. There were thousands of countries, kingdoms, tribes, empires, some of them advanced, massive cultural and scientific entities, starting primarily with Egypt, but including any number of ones, listing a few of them: Babylon, Persia, Greece, the Romans, The Chinese, the Japanese, Nubians in Africa, and the Kush in Africa, Arabs, Aztecs, Incans, all of them reached a certain level of progress and then began to stagnate and eventually decline. So if intellectual progress is nothing more than a matter of time or a few key factors like having food or certain intellectual ideas that begin to be promoted, then why didn't Egypt develop into the modern world before Christ was even born? The Egyptians were an advanced culture 3,000 years before Christ. That means we are 1,000 years closer to Christ than Christ was to the golden age of Egypt. And yet somehow they stagnated. They didn't go any further. Well, how about others? And then we see that Babylon did the same. So did Persia. So did the Kush. So did the Chinese, the Japanese, the Incans. They all reached a point and then began to decline. Even the Romans, who had a touch of Christianity before their decline, you can see they were on the decline before Christ was even born. As shortly before, the Republic of Rome collapsed into an empire. And already you can see societal degradation in their society. If anything, Christianity helped stave that off a little longer before a complete collapse happened. So maybe that was the best time, because that was a time when the roads of Rome would be able to spread the gospel as far as it possibly could be spread in that particular point. But who knows why exactly God chose to enter the modern world then, or enter the world then. And interestingly enough, the precepts, because the focus here is on not just so much the individuals that impacted things, because those individuals could have impacted things regardless, but the ideas that Christ specifically promulgated that changed the way the world thinks. And in every way that the world has adopted those ideas, we have grown. And whenever we begin to stray away from those ideas, we begin to decline. Christ has pointed out the very nature of how things work, and we either choose to accept that or not. And the more we accept it, the greater civilizations tend to grow, and the less we accept it, the more it begins to decline. And we're already seeing that in the modern world. The more we move away from Christ, the more society is beginning to degrade. The very structures upon which it is built are no longer being held up, and it's falling apart. We'll get into that more later. So what are those main ideas? We have to go back to Jesus' time to be able to understand what the ancients were dealing with. We have a very different way of looking at the world than the ancients did. And we know this from scientific archaeological study. You can go and look at what were certain things that were common in ancient mindsets. Different cultures had different ones, but there were a couple overarching themes. One of them was the idea of cyclical time. A lot of cultures saw time as being round. It repeated itself. And they got this from observing nature. After all, the day and night keep repeating themselves, the years keep repeating themselves, the moon phases keep repeating themselves, so does the cycles of life and death. So they just thought there's a constant renewal of birth, life, death, rebirth. And that's the way they saw time. Almost all ancient cultures see time that way. Well, when there is no progression, when we have no idea of things orderly in a line, we don't tend to want to grow further. Why should I work on building something up or something that will last forever? It's going to die and then be reborn in some new way. There is no growth. There's no permanence to growth. And so a lot of cultures saw no need to systematize learning, no need to move in a particular direction, until Jesus adds a new concept of a more linear time. This whole Judeo-Christian idea of there was a creative point, and then we sinned, and then God begins to welcome us back and try to coax us back, culminating in Christ himself, who comes and saves us, and then builds the kingdom for the end of time, when he will return. We have an expectation of the kingdom being built here on earth, as well as, seeing Christ at the end of time. This radically changes the way that humans approach, especially the Christian humans in Europe, approached their reality. We're moving somewhere. We can become more like Christ. We can become more like God by learning about him and continuing to grow in that direction. So let's do it. And they began to do just that. The second was the idea of a law of nature. We do not appreciate how chaotic the world was in the mind of an ancient. We have systematized so many things now that we oftentimes don't even see the world as chaotic anymore, or the universe in general. But to them, it was generally chaos. Yeah, they recognized that there were patterns, and sometimes those patterns could be exploited in one way or another. It's not like we didn't see science developing in some ways prior to Christ. But a lot of times they believed that these were, they believed in something called animism in a lot of cultures. And animism is the idea that every single item has a soul of its own. And so it kind of sometimes just makes decisions based upon whatever it likes. So their theory on gravity was that when you drop a rock and it falls towards Earth, it's because all items have an affinity towards Earth. So they just want to naturally go there. So the rock just goes down to Earth. They had no idea that forces were acting upon it. They're just like, well, the rock likes Earth, so it goes down to Earth. Everything does this. And that's how they saw the entire world. So when things broke their mold of like, well, normally this happens, but every now and then something strange happens, like maybe a magnet no longer falls to the earth but is stuck to a piece of metal instead, like, well, apparently this rock doesn't have affinity for earth. So who knows what's going on? Something's messed up with the soul of this rock. And that's the way they viewed things. Jesus introduces the idea of a rational God, creator of all. And as being rational, the early Christian thinkers began to go, well, God's rational. He made rational beings. He made us to understand him and his creation. And so maybe the creation he made is rationally ordered as well. The idea that nature follows a set of rules comes directly from Christian teaching. There are a few ancients who may have believed that there were some sort of rules, but they never progressed past an individual or small sects. This was the first time a large group of people, an entire culture, began to believe that there could be systematized rules. Because of that, they began to study the earth. Now, along with that, the monks began to look into this in particular. And so they added something that had also not been seen: a large, systematized, shared knowledge. Now, in the ancient world, the only way to really protect intellectual property was to keep it a secret. So if you figured out how to make a metal, if you could smelt an iron better than anyone else could, and with less impurities, that was stronger and made a better spear or sword, you did not want your neighbor finding out how to do that. Because if you did, they could use it to kill you. Or if you happened to be a wine merchant and you figured out a way to make wine that was particularly good, you did not want other people knowing how to do that, because then it made you had competitors. Same is true of the ancient religions. They tended to be the most educated people. They oftentimes had basic knowledge of chemistry and mechanics and different types of thermodynamics and things like that. We have evidence in all sorts of different designs that they made from before Christ even was born, where they were utilizing all of these things. But if they showed the people how these things worked, then the magic behind their particular deities is gone. And so they never talked about it except amongst their inner circles, the very closest people. And those who were in the inner circle would learn, and eventually the knowledge would die out as eventually it wouldn't get passed on. Somebody would die before that knowledge was passed, and then everyone would forget how to do it. And so that knowledge was never systematized and brought out in a large way. Monks added a whole new element. Here you have a group of people, and religious in general, not just the monks, but the religious sisters as well. But the monasteries added a whole new level. You've got a group of people who are living together in community. They care nothing about power or wealth. What they care about is loving the Lord and loving His people. That's the teachings Jesus taught them. So they look at the natural world, which again now is rational, and they begin to look at things in ways that they could improve things. And the monks, throughout the Middle Ages, add a plethora of new designs and technologies and things like that. Some of them rediscovering some of the things that the Romans did, some of them adding new things that had not been done before. But regardless, the thing that was unique about it this time is we have evidence of this where a discovery would be made in a monastery in Spain. And within 2 or 3 years would be across every monastery in the totality of Europe. Every single one of their order would have it. And it's because they would share the information from monastery to monastery. And then, when people asked them, like, hey, how do you do that? They would tell them. They wanted to help the people to grow. And so there's a drastic increase in technology over the course of the Middle Ages. A lot of times the Middle Ages are seen as the Dark Ages, and parts of them were, because there was a general collapse in knowledge after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But if anything, it was the church that both preserved what was left from antiquity and then improved upon it, and then went even further. Because as time went on, when it got to the late Middle Ages, they were sharing information in whole new ways. They began to create the university system. Started out as little schools connected to the cathedral of a diocese. And then the cathedrals of major cities like Paris and London, their schools got even bigger. And so as those schools got bigger and bigger, there were so many people learning, they had to find a way to keep track of who was doing what and whether or not they were learning the correct thing. Because the church believed that there was a distinct and unique truth. And so we had to discover that truth. We were open to learning that truth in many different ways, but we had to make sure to stick to the truth. So it was the first time that an entire body governing truth was developed, and the first time that the idea of grades and different types of degrees were mentioned. It's the first time that learning really becomes systematized. There were schools in the ancient world, and there were definitely teachers, but it tended to be that when you were a teacher, you gathered followers around you, and then you just taught them. And then they would go out and teach their thing, adding upon whatever they'd learned from you. And as they grew throughout their lives, might learn other things, and then they would gather a group and teach their group. But things would get lost in the midst of that. This time, there's actually a curriculum. Now we finally say, oh, if you want to be an expert on this, you need to know this, this, and this. This has never happened in the history of the world up until this point. And that, in the late Middle Ages, basically spawns the Renaissance. And then the Renaissance turns around and attacks the church and basically says, oh, what a dark age of non-learning that was. And that's one of the reasons why people today believe that the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, were such a place of non-learning, is because they've been attacked over the years, mainly by anti-Christian atheists who don't like the idea that this is true, that the church really is the one that built up modern learning. Now, along with that, the scholastics of the late Middle Ages, they had the seedbed of the Renaissance, the school of Chartres, especially Thierry of Chartres. There's condemnations of certain aspects of Aristotle, which forced thinkers to go beyond what they had thought before. because a lot of times Aristotle and Plato were generally believed by all intellectuals for well over 1,000 years, just because they were Aristotle and Plato. And like, well, they're the greatest thinkers of all of history, so why wouldn't we believe them? But while they had some things right, they had some things drastically wrong. And because the church questioned some of those things and went, well, there's actually no proof of that, and it kind of conflicts with some of the stuff we believe in Scripture, so let's say no to this and try to rethink that. And in the process, pushed beyond some of the things that had been held as just general rules for thousands of years. Sir Roger Bacon and St. Albert the Great. Roger Bacon was a Franciscan in England in the 1200s. St. Albert was shortly after him. Actually, they coexisted for a brief time, but Albert was in France, I believe. Anyway, Albert was also one of the teachers of St. Thomas Aquinas. The two of them were very big scientists in their day. St. Albert was a huge naturalist and believed in looking at the objective reality. So he would focus on, he's quoted as saying, not simply to accept the statements of others, that is, what is narrated by people, but to investigate the causes that are in work for themselves. So he wanted to focus on direct observation. And while there have definitely been scientists who have done that before him, he and Roger Bacon both made this focal point on direct observation of experimental data and started the process of systematizing the idea of doing that. Over the course of the next century or two, that became honed down into what is today the modern scientific method. And to this day, we still use the modern scientific method as a way to get to truth in science. And they are basically the beginnings of that. And it comes out of the ideals that I talked about earlier that come from Christ, plus, one's a saint, the other's a Franciscan. So pretty clearly, the church was involved in scientific developments and theories during that time. So the concept of natural laws basically comes from Christian teaching. And actually, interestingly enough, there's not even that much objective scientific evidence of the natural laws or the natural order of science. Like, there is evidence of it, but it's not by far a law. Like, if we really think about it, how long have we been observing the universe? 10,000 years-ish. How long have we been observing it in a solid scientific method? Not even 1,000. How long have we been observing it really closely with advanced technology? About a century. That's not a long time when it comes to the billions of years of the universe. It's entirely possible that the laws are consistent now, but may completely change at some point if we base this totally on what we observe. And so the fact that science continues to believe in laws and the fact that the universe is orderly is actually based upon a presupposition of the Catholic Church from 1,000 years ago that nobody even questions anymore. Like, clearly, it's an orderly universe that follows laws. That came from us. But no scientist will ever know that or recognize that for the most part, because they just assume that's true, because that's so ingrained in us today, we don't even think about it anymore. The foundational work in timekeeping was done by the church for the most part. This was partly because we needed to keep calendars going for the purpose of liturgical stuff, but also because of our work with astronomy. Astronomy has always been seen as an important part of the church, partly because exploration of the heavens was seen as getting closer to God. So we have massive numbers of advancements in optics, astronomy, and the general work around timekeeping. Because we may not think about it today, but if you're trying to figure out the movements of the stars, having a very accurate clock helps you to understand that better. And so we had to develop very accurate clocks to be able to make that work. And so a lot of timekeeping was developed by Catholics and Christians because of that. The formulation of the Gregorian calendar. So the idea that the year is 365 and a quarter days, and that the way that it's all structured all comes from Pope Gregory and is still in use today. Okay. The Big Bang Theory was actually proposed by Father Lemaitre in the 20th century, so the Big Bang Theory actually comes from Catholic priest. Evolution is attributed to Darwin, but Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, actually a French Catholic, kind of developed the theory even earlier than he did. For geology, Father Nicholas Steno was the founder of stratigraphy, which is the science of studying the different lines in the Earth's crust. And so that whole idea and the meticulous study of that is basically the principle of geology. And in genetics, the Augustinian monk Gregor Mendel is the father of genetics, and was the first one to notice genetic connections between parents and its offspring by studying 29,000 pea plants. I have no idea how he got so interested in pea plants, but he did, and even before we understood that DNA existed, he came up with the concept of genetics interconnecting between. Now, when it comes to science, the church is oftentimes marked against because of the Galileo incident. To understand this, not that this was a particularly proud moment in the church, we have to understand a few other elements. First, Galileo was using Nicholas Copernicus's system of a heliocentric universe, and that was the primary problem that came up. Now, when Copernicus came up with the heliocentric universe, that means that the sun is the center, well, not universe, but center of the solar system, that the sun is the center of the solar system and all the planets revolve around it rather than everything revolving around Earth as originally taught by the ancients. Copernicus was lauded as a great thinker, even by the church. They thought this was a very unique theory, and it helped explain a lot of things that they couldn't explain about the stars. When Galileo discovered a few more things, like the fact that there were mountains on the moon, which broke the theory of there being a spherical, that all the planets were perfect spheres, then they celebrated it because they found, not long after that, another scientist went and confirmed with an optical telescope that yes, there are mountains on the moon. The Galileo himself was praised by the Pope. Matter of fact, when he visited Rome, he had a long audience with the Pope and ended up having a big party that the Jesuits threw him because they were so excited, like, you're brilliant, we're great, it's great to have you here. Where the problem began was Galileo began teaching a revised version of the Copernican method, system, as fact, when at the time there was not sufficient evidence to prove that it was fact. He looked at the data that was coming in, took a couple logical leaps, and went, this is the thing that makes the most sense. I believe this to be fact. There were a few scientists that were like, buddy, there's not enough empirical evidence for this yet. It's a great theory, but until we prove it, you can't tell people that it's a fact. And he's like, I don't care. I'm smarter than you. This is a fact. And it turned out he was right, but the church did censure him because, like, no, you can't teach things without the proper scientific data as fact. And so that's what ended up happening with Galileo, and he was put on house arrest. Turns out, longer down the road, there was enough data to prove him right, and he was exonerated after his death. And the church has always has apologized for that and has kind of regretted that, because that one point is thrown against us over and over again for being anti-science, which, by the way, the Protestants at that time were in upheaval about the idea of the Copernican design because it went against their idea of what was literally true in the Bible, because Protestants are mainly literal about the Bible, but the Catholics are not. So they got to the point, it's like, no, this is a perfectly valid possibility. That's what the evidence is supporting. But for some reason, we have now been lumped into this idea because of one event, when in reality, if you look at the totality of how many things the church has helped develop in science, we are not anti-science. But the scientists who are anti-church took this, blew it up, and made a point of trying to marginalize the church's efforts in science because of it. What are some other areas outside of science that have been impacted by the church? One of the big ones is the moral life of the world. We're the only entity left in the world promoting the combat of sin. And as I've mentioned before in some homilies, the 7 deadly sins are directly responsible for every single social injustice. There's not a single social injustice on the planet that doesn't have one to all of the 7 deadly sins functioning in it. And we're one of the few that actually makes a concerted effort to teach the fighting of these sins and how to do that, but most people actually give us a hard time about asking people to do that. Impacts to philosophy and sociology. We have a ton of philosophers and sociologists throughout the history of things, like literally hundreds and thousands. So I can't really list them all. The big ones are St. Augustine, St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, Blessed Duns Scotus, Suarez, Blaise Pascal. So those are some big philosophers. One of the big things that Jesus changes also is the universal dignity of all humans. It is generally not appreciated that prior to Christ, that was not a thing. Maybe some cultures it was, but it was in isolated pockets in weird places on the planet. Mostly speaking, your dignity, your rights, were based upon your place in the social order. And even tribal groups today, that tends to be the case. How you're treated, what rights you have, are based upon if you are a leader, man or female, whatever that might be, child, they're all going to get different things. Rich or poor, a slave, all of that depended upon where your rights were. Jesus introduces the idea that everybody is a child of God. That is a unique concept to Christ. Everybody's a child of God, and everybody is equally loved by God as his children. So if you are the grand poobah emperor of the universe, or the lowest slave of a slave, you are still a child of God, and therefore have the dignity as you are made in his image and likeness. Again, unique. That's not something that even the pagan gods would do. They would make us, but they wouldn't make us in their own image. That just was kind of disturbing for a god to do. But Jesus changes that. So now, any true Christian must recognize the universal dignity of every single human being, from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death. This leads to a whole slew of philosophical points, like ending slavery. And by the way, the church has fought and ended slavery multiple times. In the ancient world first, and then it came back in the modern world precisely because of that group of anti-Christians in the intellectual circles who looked at Europe and went, look how advanced Europeans are as opposed to the whole world. We've now traveled the entire planet, and everywhere else is not as advanced technologically and often culturally as the Europeans. So clearly we're better. It must have something to do with an improved size of our brain or something like that. No, it had everything to do with the fact that Jesus Christ came, and more Christians were in Europe than anywhere else. And so they began to believe this, and it began to create a new strata of, well, we're greater, and they're lesser, which was used to justify a whole slew of abuses through colonialization, as well as the new slavery that came up, far worse than the way ancient slavery was in the first place. And now that slavery's been officially outlawed again, we see a rise in human trafficking. So we can disguise slavery in a new way, because humanity, for whatever reason, keeps wanting to go back to that. As we move away from the ideals of Christ, we move away from that idea of human dignity for all, slavery is one of the first things that begins to come back up. Because of the universal dignity, the church denounces all forms of racism, all forms of sexism, all forms of homophobia, xenophobia, or generally hating anyone for any particular reason, because they are a child of God. We may disagree in certain elements, but they are a child of God and must be treated as such. And we fight any ideology that does not recognize that universal dignity. The sanctity of life, because of this, denounces infanticide. The amount of kids that were just randomly killed in the ancient world is staggering. They would often just abandon somebody who, especially if they were deformed in some way, and just abandon them. Kids were oftentimes sold off into slavery because the family couldn't afford to feed them. There was all sorts of craziness around that. The first time that, and they would sacrifice children to their gods. So the church has stood up and crushed a lot of that until abortion basically became a modern sterile way to sacrifice our children to our new idols of greed or, career or personal time or whatever it might be, that technically we're still performing child sacrifices on a daily basis and in a more clinical and industrialized way. So still fighting against that. So denouncing abortion, denounces execution of criminals, denounces human sacrifice in every way, and denounces eugenics, which again was supported by the early 20th century by a lot of people who were considered to be liberal and secular thinkers who thought that disabled should be put to death or at least sterilized in order to cleanse the gene pool, which leads directly to things like what happened in Germany during World War II. The church introduces the idea of free will because we are rational people that can make our own decisions, and because those decisions determine whether we're following a path towards Christ or a path away from Christ, a good or bad, and we have that ability, we have free will. And that was sometimes considered and sometimes not in the ancient world. Because of this, it introduces the idea of conscientious objection. So that's for the draft, but it's also for other things. St. Thomas More objected to the marriage of King Henry VIII, but he chose not to say why. He chose a conscientious objection. And in the law at that time, it was understood that you didn't necessarily have to do something if your spirit felt that there was something wrong with it. And so he stood against that. And that for years, they couldn't execute him because he had done nothing wrong. He just said, I'm not saying anything about it. I'm not denying the king. I'm just saying I do not want to sign this particular document. And eventually, the king killed him anyway. But that idea of being able to object against something just because I don't think this is right, to be able to hold the conscience to something higher, that is a Christian idea. The church also created the first integrated law system. Now, some may say, oh, wait, no, laws definitely existed before Jesus. That is very true. Matter of fact, you have the Ten Commandments as a perfect proof of that, as that happened, well over 1,000 years before Jesus was born. You have the Code of Hammurabi, you have multiple law codes all over the planet. The difference is the church for the first time took philosophy and applied it to law. So before, law codes would basically be whoever the governing body was, normally the monarch, but occasionally a republic of some kind or tribal groups, whoever was in charge would say, new law, boom. And then the next 10 years, a new leader comes along, it's like, this is a new law. And then the next 50 years, a new law, new law, new law. Some of these laws made no sense. Some of them conflicted with one another. Some of them were just way out there. There was no codified system. Now, a few of them did codify and shrink them down, but none of them applied philosophy to it. The church is the first one to do that. So we took our philosophy and went, hey, if we believe in the universal dignity of human beings, or if we believe in Christ, doing this or that, and so the different teachings of the church, how does that apply to how we utilize law? And so the idea of universal rights comes out of that, along with, and actually the first usage of that was in the 12th century with the Pope Gratian. And he began to systematize church law, and then he encouraged the kings of Europe to do the same. This formalized, the church formalized and insisted upon due process of law, that whatever the law was, it needed to be followed. There were times when, the law was basically whoever won the battle, they were right. It's like, well, you just get into a fight. Trial by combat was a thing. They would just like, all right, you and me, let's go fight. Whoever wins, clearly God likes you more, so you're right. Could be completely wrong, but you're right. And so that was a common thing. Now due process says, no, we got to make sure to follow certain protocols to make sure we determine what actually is the truth. Legal principles, such as the idea of good faith, doing things in good faith, reciprocity of rights, the idea that we are all equal before the law, again, that comes out of the universal idea of dignity, the idea of trial by jury, to make sure that nobody's manipulating the system, or at least try to prevent that as much as possible, the idea of habeas corpus, and obligations to prove an offense beyond a reasonable doubt. So those are all ideas that come out of the church and canon law and things like that. Like I said, we introduced the world to universal human rights. So the idea that you have a right to speak, or a right to assemble, or a right to religion, that all stems from the church's idea of universal dignity. Decreed consent was necessary for marriage. So not that this was necessarily lived out all that well, but the church did teach from a fairly early state that, at least from the 1200s, that it was required that both consented to the marriage in order for it to happen. Now, in a lot of places, sometimes that would be played out as all she had to do was say yes, because oftentimes it was the woman being manipulated into this, and there was plenty of ways that manipulation could be enforced from outside. As time went on, the church put more and more stops to that, but the way that people live things out and the way that the church actually teaches are not always in line with one another. But before that, a woman could be forced to marry somebody, and the church changed that idea. Popularized the idea of equity and justice as central to law and authority, and created the concept of international law. There was no idea of anything being above the king. Matter of fact, in the ancient world, for the most part, the king was seen as the universal lawgiver. So, not only was the king above the law, he was the one that gave the law. So, if that's the case, the king can't ever go against the law. So kings would oftentimes do whatever the heck they wanted. And then emperors, of course, being even higher, would do the same thing. But the church introduced the idea of, no, God is above the king. And so there are certain things that are according to God's law that is above the idea of the king. And you can make a point that this is more of a Judeo-Christian thing, as there's some evidence of this in the Jewish and Israelite kingdoms as well. But it was not a common thing before that. And so we actually get in the 16th century a group of Spanish Jesuits standing up to the Spanish government, and particularly petitioning the Pope to come in and fix these problems as the Spaniards were abusing the indigenous peoples of New Spain. And so the Spanish Jesuits are actually standing up and saying, no, you are mistreating these people. They have human dignity. You cannot do this. And it's one of the first cases of a group of people from their own nation critiquing their king. That happened a lot. But critiquing their king, particularly on how they're treating another group of people. Normally the critique was like, hey, you're not feeding us enough, or you're taxing us too much, or something like that. But in this case, it's like, no, you're mistreating these foreigners. We can't have that, and appealed to Rome to do something about it, and began to generally promote the idea. And there were several other cases that also kind of lay the groundwork for what would end up becoming more of a UN League of Nations things later on. Moving on from law, we have language. Never really thought about this till I started studying it, how much language has been impacted by the church. The centrality of Greek and Latin to Catholicism has greatly facilitated popular literacy. So as the church went out, it taught people slowly how to read, and in general brought the ancient classics with them. Along with that, we transmitted the concept of alphabets to the world. Most languages were originally some sort of pictograph, something similar to the way the Egyptian hieroglyphics are, or different hash marks, or something like the Chinese with their characters. And those, because of the way those systems work, they require vast numbers of symbols and are very difficult to learn. Where the Greeks, who developed the alphabet, literally alpha beta, named after the first two letters of their alphabet, they took the symbols for the sounds themselves. So rather than having a picture of water and then a picture depicting land and a picture doing this, you use the letters individually to construct sounds that make words. That was something kind of unique to the Greeks, and the church helped spread that all over the world. As our missionaries went and we wanted to teach people how to read the Bible, we would teach them our language, and a lot of times would create alphabets for their particular languages as well, or help to write down their languages for the first time. There are many indigenous languages that were recorded by missionaries for the first time, and the only reason we have any idea of what they were is because of the work that they did. We also helped to create to develop several ones. The Armenian, Georgian, and Cyrillic alphabets are all from Catholic missionaries. Also, the Carolingian minuscule of the 9th to the 12th centuries, and the Gothic minuscule, both of which are not really used anymore, but they were a type of alphabet from the Middle Ages. Catholicism provided the cultural framework for the Divine Comedy, the Song of My Lord, and the Song of Roland. They are vernacular works that greatly influenced the development of Italian, Spanish, and French. The Catholic Hymn of Caedmon in the 7th century is probably the oldest extant text of Old English. And Abbe Huet, a priest who invented crystallography, which I'm not entirely sure what that was, founded the first school for the blind. His most famous student is Louis Braille, who developed the Braille alphabet. Going on to economics, several scholastics contributed foundational concepts to economic theory of money and value. So the scholastics are a group of learned people and teachers. St. Thomas Aquinas would be classified as a scholastic, that were from the beginning of the High Middle Ages to about the Renaissance. And the scholastics went into a whole depth of learning that had never really been done before. Today, they're oftentimes seen as being backwards because most of their thoughts on learning revolved around God, but they actually developed a lot of the systematized thinking that led to the Renaissance in the first place. So scholastics added a bunch of economic theories as well, several of which are still in use today, as well as some of the foundational stuff on how money functions and how values work. One of the big ones, Cardinal Cajetan also was the founder of expectation theory in economics. There's a fight in economics between the subjective theory of value and the objective theory of value, or the labor theory of value. So one theory basically states that value is given subjectively. So I think that my iPhone is worth, $800 because that's how much I care to pay for it. Whereas the objective theory would be, well, due to the materials and the cost of the materials and the amount of labor that went into it and all of the design features and the efforts that went into making it, that's what gives it value. But several economists have pointed out, well, if that's the case, then why are diamonds seen as being so much more valuable than water, as water is more useful than diamonds are, and more work is put, or for that matter, if I spend my day gluing beer cans together, I've put a lot of effort into that. Well, why is that not seen as more valuable than my iPhone? And so clearly that doesn't work, though it has been seen that particular theory of labor was largely picked up by Calvinists, because John Calvin taught that work was a sign of your internal disposition. So while work wasn't necessary, work showed that you were a follower of Christ, one of the elect. And so it developed the Protestant work ethic. And so this idea of we got to constantly be working comes from John Calvin, and it's a misuse of this particular theory of value also gets picked up. And so we find that in Protestant countries, they tend to believe more the labor-based theory than the subjective value. And where does Marxism come from but Protestant England? And Karl Marx basically grabbed this Calvinistic idea and decided that no, value is based upon labor, and he integrates that into his Marxism. So a lot of communistic stuff is interconnected with this false theory that the church actually disproved long before Marx ever was born. But constantly working against that as well. The basics of business and contract law come out of the church as well. The concept of a corporate personality comes from parishes, actually. So, like, the parish is a corporation. It's known as a legal person, and so the idea that it can own its own property, even though it's not a person, and that had never really been a thing in the ancient world. And so companies now do the same thing. Like Apple can own billions of dollars worth of land and production and things like that, and then the people who own Apple can control that, but Apple itself runs its own things. So the idea of a corporate entity is from canon law. The invention of deposit check comes from the Knights Templar, actually. The Knights Templar set up a bunch of stations all the way down to the Holy Land so that when pilgrims were on their way there, they could find places to rest where they could safely sleep and get some food. And along the way, it occurred to the Templars that money was dangerous to carry on the road, and it was really hard to hide a big old sack of coins. So if you deposit that money at one of our facilities, we'll write you out a note and we'll hand it to you. And that note, you can hide that piece of paper very easily somewhere on your person or in your cart or whatever, and then bring it to the next station, and you can actually show it to them, and they will give you the money, or some of the money, however you want to do that. And it's the basic concept, it's the earliest version of banking, essentially, of deposits, checks, cash even, the idea of like that paper money, though China had something similar to that as well. That's how banking kind of got integrated, was from the Knights Templar. The church also overhauled charitable giving. Prior to that, in the ancient world, charitable giving was done to promote an individual. This was particularly common in Rome. Roman aristocrats would give lavish amounts of money, would throw games, would party with people, things like that, in order to get their support. So if I pay, like there were patrons, and so basically people would line up at their house in the morning and they would pay them, and the idea would be, all right, now you're Caesar's man. And then after that, if Caesar asked you to vote a particular way, you voted that way. Or if Caesar asked you to like go stand in the forum and, you know, kind of give a hard push towards whatever, you did it. So there were these different factions doing that, and that's basically what gift giving was, either that or to promote, like, look how lavish I can be. I can just share money with anybody. The church bases it on that universal dignity. So everybody has worth and should be taken care of. And the fact that Christ repeatedly tells us to take care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, the strangers, the foreigners. So we do that. And even in ancient Rome, there are accounts of Romans who persecuted Christians, like persecuted in a rough way and then even killed some of them, watching as their city got hit by a plague. People would cast their family out of the house if they had the plague. It's like, nope, you're not coming in here. I don't want to get sick, you stay outside. And in the midst of doing that, they'd be left out on the streets, and Christians would come by, pick them up, bring them home, and care for them. Sometimes getting the disease and dying themselves because of it. And Roman after Roman remarks like, Why would you do this? It's like, this makes no sense. These people hurt you and persecuted you, and now you're caring for them even when their families won't, and even to the point where you're willing to die about it. And there's several stories of people converting precisely because there was a Roman soldier in particular who saw this and went, there's something powerful here. Why would anybody do that? This is something very different from what I've heard. And he ends up converting, becoming Christian himself. So totally, and then even the way that Christ talked about giving, don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. So it becomes much more different. The way that charities operate today, all of that is due to what Christ taught and how that changed. The creation of hospitals. Hospitals did exist in the ancient world, sort of. They were usually for veterans that had been maimed in a war, and even then it was rare. It was only in a couple cities that they had some sort of systematized care for the veterans. Once in a great while, a temple might be dedicated to curing or something like that, but they didn't really spend much time caring for the people. They waited for the gods or whatever to heal them, and so the people might have to buy food or whatever, but it wasn't devoted to doing what a hospital does. Hospitals came out of the idea of offering hospitality. So early Christians began setting up these houses. They were for the poor, the widows, the orphans, the sick, the lame, basically anyone who was of the lower levels of society who couldn't take care of themselves. You could come to this house of hospitality and religious orders would take care of you. As time went on, it became more and more focused on medicine in particular and taking care of those people. So the entire medical system and the hospitals, that all comes from the Catholic Church as well. Music. Modern Western music is a direct result of 1,200 years of Catholic development. The modern musical notation was invented in order to carry liturgical hymns from place to place and chants around the world. We didn't invent a lot of the music, and there was rudimentary versions of musical notation prior to Christ in the ancient world, but none of it became as systematized as it was in the church and the whole system that we use today. And if it hadn't had a systematized sense of notation, I kind of wonder how many instruments would have been developed over time if we didn't have that to be able to expand the plethora of music. The contributions to art and architecture are so large that you can't really list them all. I'll list a few of the big things. While certainly not created by the church has been the greatest promoter, protector, perfecter, and general patron of the arts and architecture throughout its history. The great basilicas of ancient Rome are an example of this. The works of Giotto, who initiated a realism in painting, the Franciscan Stations of the Cross, which helped to inspire three-dimensional art and drama, the invention of one-point linear perspective by Brunelleschi, and the great works of the High Renaissance. The later include the works of Blessed Fra Angelico, and today who is the patron saint of art. The unrivaled works of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Caravaggio, Michelangelo, Bernini, and many other artists, including the Sistine Chapel. When you see these, almost all of them are inspired by biblical things. You can see Judeo-Christian culture through all of it. You go through a fine art museum from anything from the Renaissance back, you see religious thing after religious thing after religious thing, because that's what inspired them. It took them out of themselves and gave art a direction to go in. Art had stagnated since basically ancient Greece, and now suddenly it's inspired, infused with a whole set of new ideas and concepts that came out of Christian thinking and going beyond our world into something even greater. And you see how the artists each presented that in their own way. Catholic civilization is also the founder of several genres of architecture, such as Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic, High Renaissance, and Baroque. So all of those are things we produced. The empowerment of women is also something that has been going on in the church. Hasn't always been so with some of the church leaders, but it has been part of church teaching for a while. Again, partly because of universal dignity, But also the Virgin Mary is the most important human being who is not divine. Like, there's nobody greater and more venerated than her. And then second, Mary Magdalene is one of the early church mothers and is the first witness to Christ's resurrection. It's right in the gospel. It's hard to miss. So I don't know why that... There were times when the church kind of pushed against that, but it's I don't know why they would. St. Hildegard of Bingen was a doctor of the church. She's a polymath and autodidact whose brilliance was as broad as Da Vinci's. St. Catherine of Siena was a doctor of the church. She's a laywoman, but managed to not only serve her local community, but had the ear of the European courts, particularly the Pope himself. She was known to chastise the Pope for not doing what he was supposed to do. St. Catherine Drexel gave up a vast fortune to found a religious order for the care of Native Americans and blacks here in the United States, and that's just 3 of thousands, so I'm not going to go into all of them. Catholic civilization also produced many of the first female scientists and professors. There was one in Salerno, Trotula of Salerno in the 11th century. Dorothea Bucca was the chair of medicine at the University of Bologna in 1436. She died in 1436. Elena Lucrezia Piscopoia died in 1684, was the first woman to receive a doctorate of philosophy. And Maria Agnesi, 1799, first woman to become professor of mathematics and was appointed by Pope Benedict XIV as early as 1750. These are a general overview of the historical elements and ways in which the church has impacted the world. I've gathered a lot of this material from a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, and that is by Thomas E. Woods, Jr., PhD. And I have assembled some of it from my own knowledge and different things that I have studied. I would recommend going deeper because, quite honestly, this is a very brief and basic overview of this, and the immensity of this is just awe-inspiring. The longer I've studied it, the more I've become just amazed how the church Christ has touched everything. There's not a single thing he hasn't touched. So when this question from the video that didn't play gets asked, well, what did the church do? Everything. We've literally done everything. We have, if not directly, indirectly influenced everything. All that is good, for the most part, stems in some way, was either perfected by, improved upon, cared for, or generally promoted or grown out of the church. The things that didn't were primarily where even the hierarchy of the church began to stray from the actual teaching. So anywhere where the hierarchy or the members or even just society as a whole strays from the teachings of Christ, we begin to see these errors popping up and all sorts of problems being, generated. As far as the notes that I have the notes from this, I did not want to print a bunch of them off, so if you would like my notes, it's like 9 pages of bullet points about different things, and I didn't go into all the details on some of it. If you would like to have it for reference, email me and I will send you the digital copy. This was also live streamed and I believe archived for YouTube, so if you want to watch something from this again, you can. Other than that, got a few minutes for questions, but that's my presentation for tonight. So, any thoughts, questions? Thank you. Any thoughts, questions, comments from anyone?
You talk about holidays.
Holidays, right? Yeah. Didn't even think about that. Mainly because most of our holidays are religious in nature, and so I'm staying away from a lot of the religious stuff, but I didn't think about that fact. The structure of the week, let me add that in general. Holidays. Okay, so yeah, because the concept that there be a day off was really Jewish. None of the other ancient cultures basically had that. There would be feasts where they would have vacation time, but all of that was based upon the calendar as a general rule. and there was no consistent day off. It wasn't until the church brought about, all right, well, we have the Sabbath day, and then we have the day of the Lord, and so the idea of having a weekend stems from the church. Like, well, let's take the Sabbath and the day of the Lord off, the day he resurrected and the day that God rested. It'll be a day of rest and a day of prayer for everyone. So the idea of a 5-day work week also comes from the church, along with a lot of our major holidays, but you probably knew that already. Did you have more? You said you had a whole list of them?
University.
Well, yes, the university system. I did mention that. Yeah. Did I skip over that? I said it? Okay. I got worried for a moment. Like, the university system, yeah, that stems out of the monks. So, yeah, the whole university. And the weirdest part is, if you go to a graduation today, you can see the remnants of the church in it. Like the fact that they wear gowns, like liturgical vestments. Notice all the different symbolic motions and gestures, the movement of a tassel, like the different layer, like you have a higher and higher gownage. Like the doctors have the most advanced, cool looking liturgical stuff, whereas the high school graduates have next to nothing. And yeah, the process of how it falls, like the authority of like a mace or something, depending upon what type of university it is, and then you have speeches by different people, and then like the whole system, the way it plays out, you can see a liturgical kind of vibe to it, and it's because originally that's exactly what it was. The graduation ceremony was a small rite within the church, and so a lot of those little pieces remain, even though nobody follows that connection anymore. It's true. I did miss the justice movement. So that in particular rises out of industrialization. So again, human dignity pushes towards first like social justice. So the phrase social justice actually comes from a Catholic priest. It has been co-opted by Democrats most recently, and what the Democrats talk about is not what the church is talking about when it talks about social justice. They're two different things, really. And it's one of the reasons why I don't use the phrase as often anymore, because I don't like to get into politics and all of that jazz. But social justice is the idea that society as a whole needs to function in a just way. And that stems from a lot of what I was talking about with law and universal dignity and things like that. And prior to industrialization, society didn't need too many concrete points to do this, as most little villages kind of ordered themselves that way naturally, as people would I'm not saying there weren't injustices, but it wasn't on the scale of industrialization. For the first time in the industrialized world, we see a separation of humanity from the work that we do, from nature, from things like that, and a system that is much larger than the individuals. It used to be like you were the baker and you knew exactly what your spot was in society because you baked the bread for the little town, or you were the candlestick maker and you made candles for everybody. Like, it wasn't complicated. The whole structure kind of fit easily into something people understood. Now the structure is so large, people get lost in the midst of that. And so the church almost immediately began recognizing that, and as early as the late 1800s, the popes are putting out documents on social justice to say, no, we can't allow industrialization and later on digitalizing things to tear down that human dignity. And so that's what true Catholic social teaching is about, is building up a society that will function justly, but that's been co-opted into some crazy stuff lately. So, yes? Yeah, more linear, more like a line. We still see cycles in nature, yes. But if you think about time, Do you think about the year repeating every year? Or do you think of it as one long line and it's demarcated into year, 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 year? And like basically the way they saw it is life just kept repeating over and over again. Yeah, kind of like Groundhog's Day, but on a larger scale, so that like over the course of a lifetime you might not notice it, but it does continue to recycle every couple hundred years or something like that. So that was their idea, is time just kept going in a giant circle, and whatever happened and came back again. So whereas now we believe there's a timeline, and time started in one spot and will end in another. And so it changed that whole perspective. We do still have cycles though, yeah. Welcome. Yes?
I just thought it was fascinating when I first had an understanding of how the scriptures came to be, but also that if it weren't for the monks in the Middle Ages, they would never have been written and preserved, and we wouldn't have them today. Do you want to talk at all about that?
About the scriptures and how they were transmitted through the Middle Ages? Yeah, the general transmission of knowledge from the ancient world to the modern is amazing, what the monks actually ended up doing through that time frame. Really, that whole system of shared knowledge is like a very analog version of the internet, and it's insane that they were able to do that. But yeah, the scriptures in particular, one of the things I find really interesting is how often Protestants will talk about sola scriptura, and it's like, well, what scripture are you talking about? Because if you don't have the tradition of explaining what books are in the Bible, or for that matter, who wrote them, as the scriptures actually are later than tradition, as they are all written in the later half of the first century for the most part, a little few earlier with Paul, but certainly after 33 AD, whereas most of the traditions come from the apostles and spread down through the centuries. So even the scriptures themselves are part of that tradition. So it's pretty bizarre to say, oh no, tradition doesn't matter, it's all in the scripture. It's like, well, the scriptures, the only reason we have them is because of tradition. And then that was passed on and carried on by the monks, and that's part of why we know the interpretations of certain scriptural passages, is because they passed that knowledge on with everything else. So like if we think about it today, we're only almost 250 years from our founding fathers of this nation, and we could easily look back at something like the Second Amendment and say, well, I have a right to go out into the woods and cut the arms off of bears because I have the right to bear arms. Or maybe just to rip my own sleeves off because I have a right to bear arms. But it's like, what they meant is to carry weapons for the defense of liberty, because they were facing that. And we know that because of our own history of how they fought in the revolution and didn't want to have another dictator take over. And if we need that knowledge to look at a document that's only 250 years old, how much more we need that information for a document 2,000 to 3,500 years old, depending upon what part of the Bible you're talking about. So, which is in a different language and in a different culture altogether. Not only that, but separating between ancients and moderns, like the way we think is so different. So yeah, we definitely need tradition to be a part of that. And I've kind of gotten off topic, I think, a little bit of what you were talking about. But yes, the transmission of the monks bringing that tradition and the scriptures with it is very critical to us properly understanding scripture.
And also the timing that if they weren't, undergoing so many difficulties in the Middle Ages, and if the printing press weren't invented right around that time, they couldn't have, or they have that,
Right.
they couldn't have propagated to, because, again, a lot of value in any Protestant tradition, I don't mean in any disrespect at all for that, but the reality is that the Protestants, as you said, so scriptura, but also the understanding that everything is the Word of God, and yet we would not have that where people couldn't read, and monks were the educated ones who could read. So it was
Yeah.
explained at the liturgy because people couldn't have read anyway, or many people said to me for years, we were always told not to read, we weren't to read,
Right.
and there's just so much more to it.
Oh yeah. And actually I've heard some scholars, when I was digging into some of the stuff on this, I think it was actually G.K. Chesterton, but I've seen somewhere where they presented the possibility that God allowed for the collapse of the Roman Empire and a trip into a darkened intellectual time precisely to purge society of the paganism and the falsehood that was already there. And so by allowing that difficult time, it actually kind of purged that out and allowed for a purification of thought to a more Christianized ideal. Now, you still had the pagans, not only of Rome, but also of the invaders, and so it took a couple centuries to kind of begin that process. And I'm not saying it was completely purified as the Middle Ages moved on. Quite honestly, there's still stuff from paganism we deal with today, but it helped to purge a lot of that stuff that was really problematic. And a lot of times you think, oh, it's just a terrible time, and it was not pleasant to live in, I'm sure, but it did have its purpose, I think, in the grand scheme of things, in clearing out a lot of junk that shouldn't have been there, both intellectually and spiritually. Right. Yeah, coming towards, and that's towards the end of the Middle Ages, yeah. Yes.
So Michael from YouTube.
Okay.
He asked if you could discuss the church's influence on warfare,
Okay.
particularly the treatment of POWs and the concept of just war, Little Russia.
Yeah. And Michael from YouTube is asking a little bit about the church's teaching on war and just war theory. Of course, the church systematized and based its theories on the universal dignity of humans, and so the reduction of warfare was a primary function of that. The church's teachings do generally move towards peace. However, there is an understanding that peace isn't just an absence of war. Peace is also established with justice. So if justice cannot be achieved without warfare, then sometimes justice requires us to go to war. And that was where just war theory came from. It's a set of rules that are requirements to enter into warfare in order to achieve justice. And I don't remember all of them off the top of my head. One of them I know is no preemptory strikes, and we would generally believe in what would today be a lack of collateral damage. So it's like you're not supposed to cause more damage than is absolutely necessary. Most of the statements on justice and warfare deal with achieving justice with the least amount of threat to human life. And that's true generally with incarceration and things like that as well. Like up until Pope Francis, the theory of the church was that executions could only happen under certain circumstances. And Pope Francis says no, but I tend to respectfully disagree with him on that, as St. Thomas Aquinas, I think, was correct. He gave one reason why a human could ever be executed, and that reason was that the person cannot be held in captivity without harming society. So like, we can't protect society from this person. And an example of this might be a mafia don who might be able to run their organization from a jail, or a person who might not be able to, who might escape from jail. A good example of that would be Pablo Escobar. Like, those people who cannot be properly restrained from hurting others and creating other injustices, that's the only time St. Thomas allows for execution. Francis says no, in the modern world there's no reason for that. I tend to disagree. I think along the lines of St. Thomas, but the Pope's the Pope and I'm just a little priest, so maybe he's right. Anything else? Oh, good, we can wrap it. Oh, well, one more.
Maybe this is another discussion for another time.
Okay.
I know that the youth of today base most of their thinking on facts from science. And I think creationism and Big Bang theory and all of this evolution and how that can really confuse things just for their belief in God and
Right.
everything. So maybe one day that could be the next chapter
Mm.
lacked to equip my child with the best answer on how it is to negotiate. Yeah, Adam and Eve, well, and then there's a whole world. Yeah, how does that come to be? And there's a lot of things you can think about.
There's a lot of layers to that question that probably can't all be answered tonight, and how creationism interacts with that. But I would say in general, I think a lot of people have assumed that there's no evidence of God, and that's not entirely accurate. There is some significant empirical evidence, but even beyond that, part of the reason why there's not like the point where, yes, there's an absolute definitive, like, yes, this is God, this is who this is, all this kind of stuff, is that we're basically the equivalent of an hydrogen atom trying to understand the star that it is a part of. And like, that can't fully happen. And so the hydrogen atom very well could think, well, there's no evidence that the star exists, despite the fact that the star is the very thing all around it. And so it's the same concept with us. It's like, there are plenty of little evidences around, little ways that the Lord influences life. Matter of fact, it's not that difficult to hear and see Him on a day-to-day basis within ourselves when we get attuned to Him. But I'm firmly convinced that He leaves Himself out as much as possible as a way of respecting our dignity, that He wants us to make a decision freely. And if we were any closer to Him, like if He was more visible to us, if that veil was pulled back a little bit more, we would not be able to resist Him. Like moths drawn into a flame, we would just go right into the bug zapper. It's like, woo, yay, I want that. And so he leaves enough distance to say, no, you need to make the decision. Do you want to follow me or not? And respects that and keeps us at that level until we make the decision in faith and stepping out there and doing that. And once we do, then He entices us deeper and deeper into that till you get to the point where the saints are like aflame with the Lord already. But yeah, and once you get to there, there's no doubt. It's like, oh, clearly He's here, and you can see His fingerprints and His radiance everywhere. But if not, if we follow the other path, it makes it so that He seems like He's not there. And it's part of the reason why there's that constant battle between Christ and Antichrist. And like, not that Antichrist, and in this point, I'm not talking about Antichrist as like one person, but all the things and people and stuff that fight against Him. And that would, be led by Lucifer, but in general, there's a lot of other minions in there that don't even understand what they're doing. And like, they don't understand how that impacts against that. And then just like, well, it doesn't look like He's there, but He is, and nobody's bothered to spend the time to really get to know Him, and because of that, have blocked off from there. But yeah, there's more that we could explore there, maybe another night. All right, well, that's just enough time that if you rush home, you can meet the kickoff of the Thursday night game. Or for those of you who are online, who probably already switched over anyway, you can go watch the Thursday night football game, because I was not pointed out till Tuesday that was tonight. I'm not much of a football fan, I'm sorry. And then in general, we do have one we have an evening every Thursday night. So don't forget that Phil does an evening of catechetical something or other for adults, and that's usually either live streamed or from Trinity Hall, I think. So you can feel free to come to that as well. So I'll give you a final blessing to close things out. The Lord be with you. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace. Have a great night. And also, I wanted to mention that Saturday, I forgot to mention on Sunday, I was thinking of doing like a rosary in honor of the victims of 9/11 after the 8:30 Mass, so about 9 o'clock. So if some of you would like to come to that, I'm going to probably do a little rosary then. So I wanted to mention it to the whole parish, but I completely forgot. So I'm going to do something like that. That changes the first weekend of October. So October 2nd, I believe, is the actual day. All righty. Have a great night.